Good day, good afternoon, good morning, depending on what side of the continent you are on. Give us just a couple of minutes. We've got a pretty steady stream of folks coming in, so we will get started in about 60 or so seconds. All right, I think we've hit critical mass. I am really excited. Thank you all for coming. Happy Wednesday. This is our 24th episode of When Things Go Wrong. Really excited to be here. We've got a great panel. I am David Vaillencourt, founder and CEO of the GMP Collective, one of a few hats I wear around the industry. Before I kick this over to Bethany, just a couple of housekeeping items. One, this episode, just like all other 23 prior to this, are recorded and available for free on our YouTube channel for your educational pleasure and viewing and sharing with the rest of the world. So if you've got to jump early, if you know some friends that missed this, please be sure to share the link with them. We will follow up within a few days after with the link and a nice recap, questions and answers. So we received a decent amount of questions during the registration process. Thank you for all of those who submitted questions. We're going to do our best to get through all of them. We've got a pretty jam-packed lineup. If during the conversations you're inspired to ask a question, use the Q&A function. Throw a question in there, and again, we will do our best to get to it. You have the ability to also ask anonymously if you're not comfortable letting us know who you are. There's no bad questions, throw them out there. And we will also do our best to follow up with getting answers to the questions we do not answer during this live webinar. With that said, we've got a sharp 1 hour cutoff, which is down to 56 minutes and counting. So let me hand it over to Bethany to take us away.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, David. Welcome, everyone. I'm happy to be your moderator of When Things Go Wrong, where we discuss various challenges and issues within the cannabis industry. I'm the Director of Content Strategy and Market Growth here at the GMP Collective, where we offer technical and strategic advising, client referral, and webinar sponsorship opportunities. So let's get started. You all know David Vaillencourt, CEO of the GMP Collective, co-founder of the S3 Collective, and vice chair of ASTM International Committee D37 on Cannabis. And also joining us for this episode is Aaron Smith, co-founder and CEO of the National Cannabis Industry Association, the largest trade association representing legal cannabis businesses in the US, and the only one focusing on ensuring that the interests of small and independent businesses are represented in the national dialogue surrounding marijuana policy reform. Welcome to the webinar, Aaron. We also have Chris Lindsey, who works for the American Trade Association for Cannabis and Hemp, where he supports ATACH's efforts to ensure safe cannabis and hemp products, as well as rescheduling and descheduling of natural cannabis. Chris has previously served as a trial lawyer, cannabis business owner, and he worked as an advocate for improving cannabis laws at the Marijuana Policy Project for 10 years prior to moving to ATACH, where he now works as Director of State Advocacy and Public Policy. Thanks for joining us, Chris. And also is Mike Lomuto, who serves as the board chair of the Minority Cannabis Business Association with over 2 decades of cannabis industry experience. Mike currently commits the lion's share of his energy to advocating for the development of an equitable industry. This includes the highly collaborative and impactful Equity Workshop Tour, which has taken him on a journey across the country organizing dozens of roundtable conversations with leaders from all different sectors of the space. Thanks to all of you for taking time out of your day to join us and discuss advocacy in the cannabis industry. So let's dive right in, make good use of our time. Can each of you briefly introduce your organization and its primary goals outside of what we've already done in your intros, and the key advocacy initiatives that your organization is focusing on this year? Chris, can you kick us off, please?
Sure, and thanks for having me here. So ATACH formed actually 10 years ago. This is our 10-year anniversary, and it really formed on the basis of two strong ideas. One is that we have to work towards standards for health and safety around cannabis products. And without going too far down the rabbit hole, that's one of the only areas where licensed legal businesses really separate themselves from the illicit market, is to say we have standards when it comes to things like health and safety. And so that's paramount. It's something that we've worked with ASTM for many years on and will continue to do so. And we also see ourselves as defenders of the state licensed cannabis industry. And that takes many different forms, and we'll have a chance to talk about some of those coming up. But it really boils down to two things today that we're focused on. At the top of the list, obviously, we're doing a lot of different things, but one is we're responding to synthetic THC, which has emerged into the marketplace. And then also we're hosting the CCSR, the organization that is working toward rescheduling as a temporary pause on our longer goal toward descheduling. So those are kind of the two areas that we're very, very involved in right now.
Good stuff. Thank you. Aaron, what's the focus of NCIA this year?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Bethany, and thanks, David. It's great to be here. NCIA started as the first trade association in the cannabis space back in 2010 to make sure that the industry had a voice nationally. Our primary focus is federal policy reform. As things have evolved and the industry has grown by orders of magnitude since then, we've carved out a niche of making sure that we are providing that platform to the small and independent businesses. And if you look at who's lobbying cannabis on Capitol Hill right now, by and large, it's companies that are even in part of big tobacco, big alcohol, and then the biggest, the top 3 or 4 biggest MSOs. NCIA really proudly represents everybody else. Our end goal is seeing federal marijuana prohibition in the rearview mirror and replaced with sensible federal regulations that apply equally to cannabis. Well, I should say marijuana derived and hemp derived and synthetic, as Chris mentioned, cannabinoid products. But in the interim, there are, we recognize that's still some years off given congressional dysfunction and a number of issues. In the interim, we've taken an active role in also advocating for rescheduling, working on bringing about tax parity for the industry that, even after rescheduling, we still have many of our legacy businesses that are facing 280E liabilities that are threatening to put them out of business, working on a retroactive relief on that, and opening up financial services and access to capital in the industry. So looking forward to the conversation.
All important stuff. Mike, what's happening? What's the focus at Minority Cannabis Business Association?
Yeah, so thanks for the invite to be here. Really appreciate you guys. Love working with collaborating with you all. And I think for MCBA, I mean, our number one priority, of course, is to make sure that minorities have a strong foothold and are able to succeed and thrive in this industry. Minorities who have been, for the most part, this is what the industry's back was built off, so to speak, coming out of prohibition, with the kind of policing that still is going on in a lot of places, especially in places where cannabis is still basically living in prohibition. And so our focus this year has really been about coalition building. The Equity Workshop Tour, a lot of that is about being collaborative, working with regulators, advocates, and business leaders alike, and really trying to bring people to the table, breaking down silos, We've been navigating or moderating an equity policy roundtable made up of over a dozen advocacy organizations and trade associations from around the country, focusing on states like Minnesota, Missouri, and New York right now. But really looking at, where can we make the most impact, especially where minorities are concerned. We're taking the equity workshop toward the South in the fall because we know that there's, at the end of the day, it's an area that really needs a lot of support and is very much siloed off in a lot of ways from other places. A couple other things we're working on. The shadow ban campaign, I should mention. We do have a petition that we've just started circulating. I'll get the link for you guys. But basically, the shadow ban that's going on with Meta, Facebook, all this kind of stuff, Instagram. I mean, it's very detrimental to really everybody in our industry, especially minority businesses, that often that is the primary way for marketing. So we're putting a petition together to get that reversed because it is something that Meta itself can actually work on that would make an impact. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's the stuff we're working on, and really looking forward to being here for today's conversation.
Heading down to the South, very important. Love that. All right, next, let's talk about your membership and their concerns and their needs and how you establish what their needs and priorities are, and maybe some of the most common concerns and needs that you're hearing from your members, and how that feeds into your advocacy efforts. Mike, let's go back to you.
Yeah, so one of the big things that we hear a lot, of course, is the capital issue, right? The access to capital, the lack of capital. But I think the more important thing that I really want to lean in on here is what you mentioned as far as how do we determine what the problems are, because that's the big problem, right? But how do we get into the granularity of how to solve that problem? And that's where things like the equity workshop tour come into play, because we believe that having, intimate dialogue, getting out there on the ground, having conversations with people is how we really start figuring out how to solve those problems, because we get to understand the nuances. And then we also get to really, tap into all the different brilliant minds that are all actively working on solving that problem, as well as other problems such as overregulation in certain places, regulations that, when I say overregulation, I mean regulations that basically are extremely burdensome for small businesses at the end of the day.
Awesome. Aaron?
So NCIA is a member-led organization. So we're kind of a very grassroots, I think, in terms of an industry association. And we have 14 member committees that focus on various sectors and fields of expertise in the industry. Those are all comprised of our members, and then we have a board of directors that ultimately controls the legislative agenda for the organization, also comprised of members. So we listen to them and get feedback from the board, of course, and then also the committees on a number of issues. And really, one of the biggest problems that we see is just that we haven't fulfilled our promise of undercutting the criminal market. Especially for small businesses, becoming increasingly difficult to compete with the underground market, which is still thriving. And places across, look at New York. From New York to California, you have either gray market, businesses that are operating without a license, but are illegal, or just straight criminal enterprises that are still trafficking in cannabis illegally. And I think it's very important for us. It's of course to make sure that our businesses can thrive and succeed, but it's also to uphold the promise we made to voters when we go state after state to voters and state legislatures and say, well, we're going to be able to institute a regulatory system that will replace a criminal market with a regulated one. And because of overregulation, overtaxation at the state level, as well as issues like 280E at the federal level, it's been very difficult for businesses to really overcome that burden. And so we've worked with regulators to really make them understand that the only way to advance the interests of public health, which is their charge, is to make sure that there's an ability for a thriving industry, because the underground market doesn't test the product, doesn't age gate sales, certainly isn't concerned about things like GMPs. While the regulated market is, and so we're really making sure that regulators are understanding that part of their responsibility of upholding public health is fostering a successful cannabis industry, as well as lobbying Congress and lobbying to, roll back prohibition, which I think, I think that a lot of the problems we have at the state level with overregulation and overtaxation is kind of a prohibition tax, and that it's sort of, justified that we said we're going to regulate marijuana like alcohol, but now we're actually regulating it like, uranium or something because it's federally illegal. So I think until we break down the walls of federal prohibition, I'm hopeful that rescheduling might get us partway there, that we can see some easing at the federal level as well.
Absolutely. Chris, how about you with ATACH and their membership?
Sure. So, the two big issues I mentioned at the beginning, synthetic THC and rescheduling, both of those were no-brainers for our members. There is pretty much universal concern. First of all, 280E, everybody faces this. It's not something I have to explain to your audience. It is crushing what that tax burden has created. And so the opportunity to relieve the industry of that burden that's too much of a promise to miss out on. And so ATACH with broad support, both within our organization and with those that we work with, started to host CCSR, which is leading that charge, and happy to be taking that role, which is very supportive of that group. And there are a lot of great folks that help make that happen. When it comes to synthetic THC, also this was universal among our members. I would say that most particularly it was driven through one committee in particular, and that was our National Council. That committee is composed of state trade associations from around the country. So we have around 15 different states that have signed MOUs with ATACH, and they just said, look, we're getting crushed here because we are seeing these products show up on store shelves and they're basically bypassing the regulatory system, and they claim to sell about the same kind of products. They were very happy to partner with ATACH in order to provide additional support in their issues at the state level. And we're seeing this play out. I would say Arizona was probably leading the charge. And understand that at the state level, the vast majority of these businesses are mom and pop shops. These are not MSOs. These are folks that are saying, I put my life savings into this business. I gave it everything. And now they're selling Delta 8 across the street. How fair is that when I'm playing by all the rules? And so that's who we're there to defend. It's against the folks who basically claim that, well, we're federally something, I guess we'll call it legal, irrespective of, big swaths of federal law that would say otherwise. And that therefore states somehow are limited in their ability to regulate these products. We disagree with that. And we think that it's very, very harmful to those who have been working so hard to get to this point to then face this kind of crisis. So universal support amongst our membership on these two issues.
Yeah, thank you all for that. And to take it a step further, the elephant in the room, the can of worms question here. What is the cannabis industry as of today? A lot has changed over the years. And, are there any specific actions your organization has taken or is taken to address those concerns and any other underlying issues in the cannabis industry that you feel need urgent attention? Let's start with Aaron.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to kind of just piggyback on what Chris has said. I think we really need to start thinking of this as a cannabinoid industry. Cannabis encompasses hemp, marijuana, and now these synthetic converted products that are out there. And yes, all of these products need to be regulated. We support regulating the hemp products through the state programs, but it also needs to be acknowledged that these state programs are absolutely crushing the marijuana industry, and that we don't necessarily need to take the same approach to the hemp products and just fold them straight into the marijuana system. We have over-regulation on marijuana, and we have under-regulation on hemp, and there needs to be a balance. We need to start, lifting some of the regulatory burden on marijuana and imposing regulations on the hemp side. On the federal area where we operate, we acknowledge that, okay, well, these hemp products were kind of probably accidentally made legal. It wasn't the intent of Congress, but as advocates for ending prohibition, we have to see that as a happy accident. And rather than working to go backwards and advancing policies such as the Mary Miller Amendment in the House, which would just bring back prohibition, we're working with allies in the Senate and others to impose to introduce legislation that would just impose some sensible, common sense regulations that require things like testing, dosage standards, and age gating, and just basic common sense regulations on these hemp products at the federal level. And I think that's really what I would like to see, some less fractious industry around this, because our members we have members from the hemp side and the marijuana side. It's funny to say the word marijuana now, but you kind of have to delineate because it is all cannabis. We've always been an umbrella organization, and this is an issue, relatively controversial within our organization. But it's hard to make the intellectual argument that, well, these D8 products should be prohibited under federal law, while for 14 years we've been saying that D9 should be legal. And so we're taking that kind of approach to it. And I think that ultimately that's the direction the industry is going. We're seeing more of the larger businesses. I just saw, I think the other day, I saw Wana roll out a hemp product, and we're seeing more, I think, merging of the two sides of the industry. And I think that's the future. And I hope to see more of that, and advancing policies that just provide kind of regulatory parity between the two without crushing one over the other.
Absolutely. Chris, how about you?
Sure. Well, we're taking a little bit of a different approach, and the way that we see it is we have a regulatory system for THC from marijuana or hemp, the cannabis sativa L plant, if you will. And it's one that we've developed in the United States over many, many years at the state level. And that's the system that we have. Would we like a different system? Sure. Nobody likes taxes. Nobody likes heavy regulatory burdens, but it is the one that we have. And by the way, not every state is the same. Some have a higher burden than others, but we don't think that it would make sense to create sort of parallel systems when we have THC that's produced from the cannabis sativa L plant that's sold to individuals either for medical or adult use. It doesn't make sense, at least from our perspective, to sort of have a marijuana program and then in some places running parallel to it, a hemp program. We think that everybody needs to get into the same program. Now, is this stuff overregulated? It is. It's a function of how we came to live with these laws, right? And I'll just give Illinois as an example. If we would have approached the legislature and said, hey, here's what we would like most of all: few rules, low taxes, let everybody have access. We'll age gate, but this is a product that hasn't really ever hurt anybody. Nobody's ever died. If we'd have approached lawmakers with that argument, they'd have said, no thanks. The only reason why there is a system at all in Illinois was because lawmakers agreed to go along with the proposal, and they tweaked it in many ways that they wanted. But now they have a system that's regulated up to residents' eyeballs in that state. And would we like something different? Yes. But when hemp interests come along, and I say hemp, what I really mean is synthetic THC. And in our book, that's not hemp, that's a different thing. And so when folks come along and say, well, we have synthetic THC and we're going to open a store and we'll call it a dispensary, and it'll look like a regulated dispensary, but it's not. And we feel good about this because we like our testing system, and we just don't think the state, yeah, it's just too burdensome. Who can afford it, right? That's not a workable system. I mean, any more than if somebody were to make bathtub gin and believe strongly in the efficacy of that bathtub gin and claim that the state should just allow them to continue to operate apart from the very burdensome alcohol regulated system that exists there, right? And that's just not a long-term strategy. That what we need to do is figure out how to regulate THC when it comes out of this plant, and whether it comes out of a test tube in the meantime or not, because multiple programs will just lead to program shopping. Like, why would the marijuana companies stick around in a marijuana program and pay heavy taxes and all the other rest if they can just go and call it hemp and they don't have to worry about nearly as much? So it's not a long-term strategy. And so what we need to do is work within the programs that we have. And if they're overregulated, then we need to address that, because that's a burden on the folks trying to follow the rules, right? Let's not punish the folks who got there early, sacrificed so much to make it happen, and then somebody else comes along and says, you know what, that's really hard. I don't know if I should have to do that. I don't accept that answer.
Yeah, I really appreciate all of your responses. Yeah. So moving forward, how does your organization evaluate various positions as far as how it impacts consumers and consumer safety? And, you know, what sort of science and data is involved or considered when you're making those decisions around lobbying efforts? Chris, let's throw it back to you.
Well, in both of our issues, it's very easy. Science does lead these discussions. Just knock out the rescheduling. It's just to say, look, there is plenty of evidence that there is medical value, right? And that's the difference between the analysis that just happened and the previous. Lots of new information fed into that decision. And so, yeah, this is a science-led discussion. When it comes to synthetic THC, we also lead with the science. And what we're doing is just educating lawmakers. We're just saying, do you understand what Delta-8 actually is? Because sure, you could probably find a Delta-8 molecule that formed in nature, but that molecule doesn't appear in any of these products called Delta-8. That comes from a synthetic conversion process. Here's how that process looks. Here are the concerns that we have when we're getting into synthetic production, especially in terms of knowing what to look for in that final product to know whether it's safe. That's a big concern that we have, that we just don't have science yet to actually even know what to test for. And so it's really educating folks, because, you know, they've heard the press that this is marijuana light, Delta-8. And so there's this sort of veneer of health and safety, because we've all come to believe that's how marijuana is. We can't really hurt ourselves very much with marijuana. And so we start then sort of assuming that, well, if this is Delta-8, it's marijuana light, that must be even safer, right? Well, if you're in the military and you believed it, if you have a commercial driver's license, had a commercial driver's license and believe it, if you had security clearance, if you expected to possess a firearm in the course of your duty as a law enforcement officer, all bets are off, because those tests don't differentiate between quote unquote legal hemp and marijuana. And so we think we just need to be a lot more straight about what these products are, and science is how we do that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Aaron.
Yeah, I mean, consumer protection drives everything. You know, that's what the reason that, you know, we have regulations in place, and that we as an industry, we want to make sure that we can, you know, continue to grow and serve the public in a way that not only just, you know, certainly not just to line the pockets of the industry, but to make sure that we're, you know, complementing public safety. And that means not, you know, in addition to having sensible regulations, but also making sure that we don't go too far and get into a situation where, you know, we have the regulatory costs and burdens are so high that businesses start failing. The small businesses fail, and we have, you know, monopolization or even worse yet, that that more consumers go into the unregulated market. So it's always having to strike that balance, and I think also not falling into the trap of protectionism, and looking at the longer term. There's products like Delta 8. These products are going to be here to stay, so we need to make sure they're regulated properly. I don't, not trying to go backwards into prohibition.
Yes, well said. Thank you, Aaron. Mike.
Yeah, so I think that Aaron and Chris hit it pretty well on the science and the public health stuff. I do want to kind of just use that to circle back to the hemp conversation, right? And I think that something to note here is that I think Aaron, you mentioned this, that one of the promises, or maybe it was Chris, that one of the promises of the regulated cannabis space is the public safety aspect, right? Testing and things of that nature. The other promise of the cannabis industry, the regulated cannabis industry, is also the ability to build generational wealth, right? Not being in the unregulated space where things are a lot more nebulous and shifting, and also at the end of the day, not viewed as legal by the government, state or federal. Whereas with the regulated cannabis industry, it's supposed to be about being able to build generational wealth. And the reason I'm saying this is because in relation to the hemp space, is that a lot of in a lot of places, and I don't want to put too much of the burden and say, hey, all these regulators are failing. I think the regulators have a really challenging position and job to do in the first place. But overall, the programs are not working for small businesses and minority-owned businesses to be able to build that generational wealth. So, Chris, going back to what you're saying, I hear what you're saying absolutely with, okay, look, like this is the program and we have to work within the program. But there's also the reality of human nature and the fact that the Farm Bill did provide this potential other avenue. And a lot of people are also investing their money and their life savings on that avenue now. And so to Aaron, to your point, I really appreciate what you said about your being a really an all-encompassing organization. We're looking at things similarly, where it's one plant, and how do we figure out through dialogue, through conversation, through listening to one another, and also educating the regulators on what this looks like. How do we get to a place where we do have less regulation in the cannabis space so that people can have less barriers to entry to begin with? I think that's the main thing we're seeing. If there wasn't such high barrier to entry in the first place, you wouldn't see the proliferation of the hemp-derived cannabinoid space in the first place, right? So I think that's something really important to kind of key in on, and again, just point towards why we really need to be working together, speaking, looking for data. One of the pieces of data that we're looking for, and anybody listening here, if you have any information on this, we definitely would love this information. We're looking to see what are the percentages of minority-owned businesses in the hemp space. We have a lot more information now on the cannabis space, but we don't have as much information on the hemp space. And so that's something that our organization is definitely looking to learn more about before we really do make any kind of categorical decisions on how to proceed. So just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, thanks. David?
Let's hit the mute button. There we go. Yeah, thanks. I want to go back to that term cannabinoids, products, looking at it as a cannabinoid marketplace and thinking about it from a consumer lens. I think it's really easy to get caught up in the day-to-day as, business owners, as industry advocates that have a, pretty solid amount of knowledge around the product and the product types and the challenges, and to step back and put yourself in general public world where what you know about cannabis, marijuana, cannabinoids, whatever you want to talk, however you want to refer to it, comes from perhaps DARE and, what happened back in the 70s. And now we've got this novel product that is just everywhere, right? In the last 10 years, we've gone from you had to know a guy to you can go buy it in some cases with a credit card, right? These transactions without cash in these brick and mortar stores, whether they're a state regulated dispensary or a convenience store or other brick and mortar store. And so from a consumer standpoint, what is this product doing for you? Why are you buying it? Is it allowing you to relax? Is it allowing you to change your consciousness? Is it having some other mind altering state at the most simplistic level? Beyond that, the consumer is not thinking, was this synthetically derived? Was this from hemp? Was this from marijuana? Does it even matter, right? That's not where their knowledge is at, because they're thinking about the end use. And so we really need to think about these products from an end use state and what's important for consumer safety. And if that's synthetic cannabinoids or synthetically created, we've seen this over 200 years of the development of the pharmaceutical industry, even advancements in food science, where we're getting really sophisticated with wicked smart scientists, PhDs, folks with advanced degrees that are, formulating, creating molecules and making these incredible products that have a value in our life. We rely on them every day. But there's a lot of testing and data and research that went into that to make sure that these products are safe, because the processes, the raw materials, those chemicals, those catalysts, if not evaluated properly, might be there. And we have to ask the questions of what could actually be in there and what's that safety data and how are we mitigating that in order to have true parity, which I think is, another common theme that we've heard today. So I just want to really encourage folks to really think about it from that framework, regardless of where you stand on marijuana, cannabis, cannabinoids, hemp, or there's maybe another term I might be missing. So thank you guys.
Yeah, thanks, David. We have about 20 something minutes left. We've made some good progress and also have received quite a few very thoughtful questions from our audience in the live Q&A. So hopefully we will have a few minutes toward the end to respond to some of those, but let's keep moving on in the meantime. To further discuss standards and best practices in the industry and the role it plays in solving some of these problems, maybe we can discuss some examples of how the adoption of certain standards can benefit your membership and the industry as a whole. Aaron, can you kick us off with this one?
Sure, yeah. And first, thanks, David. 100% agree with everything you just said. And I think that we look at these products, we need to look at, are they intoxicating or are they not? Are they being smoked? Are they being, consumed as a beverage? I think the reason I'm pretty feel maybe more positive about this situation, the quagmire around hemp that we're dealing with, is I actually think that the future could mean a system in which you have low dose hemp products that are, take beverages, for example, which we're seeing an explosion of right now, could be sold through the current system, the supply chain for alcohol to adults over 21 if they're under, say, 5 milligrams or some threshold, and then have the marijuana system side by side. And meanwhile, you've turned on an inordinate amount of consumers to low dose THC who never probably would have walked inside a dispensary, and we've provided a wellness product to them as opposed to just getting the very much more destructive, dangerous alcohol that's on the shelf next to that product. So sorry to go down the rabbit hole on this, and I think we probably should have our own full hour just on this topic. But to your question, Bethany, yeah, I mean, as we've seen, just the consumers, as the industry has expanded, as laws have marched forward, consumers have become much more conscientious and concerned for, as they should be, for their health and for the safety of the products, and especially as they are in some cases paying a premium to buy cannabis from a licensed, they shouldn't be paying a premium, but unfortunately they are, buying licensed cannabis versus buying it on the underground market. They're expecting to get the most the best experience and safety out of that. And as we see product recalls and other kind of really failures of regulation over the years, we are seeing more of the sophisticated businesses moving toward voluntarily, as you guys at GMP Collective know more than anyone, voluntarily adopting GMP standards and others. And I think that's the direction that all of the the most sophisticated operators need to go. From a legislative standpoint, we've one area as a kind of obvious example is you've got every single state almost has a different label for THC, which causes a problem for any state or any operator that's trying to operate across state lines, or packaging companies that are selling to multiple states. And I know there's that you guys I know worked on an ASTM standard label that's Now out there, it's actually in the hemp cannabinoid bill that we're working on, and as well as in many of the states that's coming on to start to provide uniformity, which will ultimately brings costs down. And so I think that you guys at GMP Collective are ahead of the curve, and your clients are those that are doing that. But I think that is certainly the future.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that. Chris.
Well, we're big fans of standards. A good example, obviously, is the universal symbol that was adopted by ASTM for being a cannabinoid or intoxicating cannabinoid containing product. Very helpful. We would like to see those symbols used on hemp intoxicants because we think that would be better information than they may be getting. I've been pretty down on synthetic THC. The exception is when states get involved in regulating it. And that's a good example of how standards can provide a solution. So here's my version, right? It would be, we start to settle on what good manufacturing practices actually are when we're talking about synthetic conversions. That can inform us of what might be a contaminant, right? Because if we know the path to take in order to produce them, then we can predict the potential contaminants. We don't actually know what those are today. So once we can identify the contaminants to look for, now we can develop testing panels designed to look for those contaminants, right? That's the system that we need to have in place. Today, we don't have that. And so how are we going to get it? Well, I doubt the FDA is going to swoop in with a secret panel that they've developed. It's going to be the states that do this. And so we very much support states like Minnesota that have done what Aaron described, which is we have marijuana products, we have hemp products, low dose, high dose, beverage form factors, others. We support that. And I can riff for quite a long time on why we support that. But that has to be driven through a regulatory system at the state level in order to get there. It can't sort of come from, well, I like this approach, I'm just going to do it and hope not to get in trouble. And so that's where we're coming from, is it needs to be driven through states, through a regulatory program. And in the case of synthetics, we've got some work to do to understand better how they can be made safely and how consumers can know that those products won't put them in harm's way.
100%. Thank you. Mike, from the MCBA's perspective.
Yeah, just to piggyback off Minnesota, I actually moved there for the summer because I really believe that it's a place that is starting to kind of crack this code. And Aaron, I think you hit it on the head, where it's brought a lot of people into the space that would never have touched cannabis, and it's normalizing it for people that still aren't touching it, but see it in regular places like pizza places, at the Minnesota, Taste of Minnesota, places like this, right? So it's been great to see that. And, I just want to kind of throw that out there. I think I saw a couple of comments in the chat, they've actually been developing how to tax it and how to regulate it and things of that nature in that state, right? But the thing I want to mention here is two things. The legacy definition that ASTM has been rolling out, I think is a great example of how a standard can be used to create dialogue around something that we kind of often kind of push underneath the rug even. When we talk about legacy operators have very much been left behind in a lot of the regulated cannabis space, in the sense that there's a very hard transition to make into it. By standardizing a definition, and we can send a definition out in the follow-up email and everything, but by standardizing a definition, it can help people understand, okay, this is what this looks like, and these are the kinds of challenges that it takes to get from being a legacy operator into a place where you can then build wealth, generationally, legally, and legitimately. So that's an example, I think, a great example of a way a standard is helping to, help people enter the industry and then show regulators how to help people figure out how to stay in that industry and be successful in it. The other thing I'll mention is social equity is a definition that has like 1,000 different definitions. And so not having a standardized definition also can be very detrimental, because it leads to lots of infighting, lots of conversation, lots of dialogue that go very sideways in different states. And as a result, also a lack of social equity then being created. So that's one of the challenges that we have by not having standardization before that term ended up rolling out and going all over the country, and people kind of taking it and using it how they needed to in different places. So anyway, just kind of want to throw out what happens when we don't have dialogue around how to standardize something as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. Very, very great point. So, all right, we're doing pretty good on time for our last couple of questions. Let's move into the regulatory landscape and some of the challenges related to regional, state, federal regulations. We've definitely covered some of those, but and then a question about how and if international regulations impact your advocacy work and the industry overall. Chris, could you start for that one?
Well, it's definitely a useful point of reference. And again, we're sort of talking a lot about hemp. So in Europe, they've also been trying to figure out what to do about these products. And they have implemented solutions. They zeroed in on HHC for some reason. We're all over here on Delta 8, even though both markets have all of these different synthetics floating around. And so it's useful just to see how different countries are responding. And there's also this element that that when we're talking about synthetic production, that stuff isn't sourced from hemp produced in the United States by and large. And I'm sure that there are exceptions. USDA doesn't know about them though, because the numbers that the USDA publishes year after year show that the hemp cultivation space is cratered in the United States from 160,000 acres right after the Farm Bill passed to 22,000. So while the hemp intoxicants industry is really exploded, production isn't there. So that means that this stuff's getting imported. And you can see the import numbers. We're many, many times now on a trade deficit because of the amount of hemp distillate that's getting imported. So what are the rules around that? Are they being followed? What is being imported? Good questions, I think, to be asked. But something that I'm watching for is when those questions do get asked.
Excellent point. Thank you, Chris. Mike.
Yeah, I think, and I'll mention, I think somebody said in the chat, we have the hearing for now that's been, it looks like it's going to be scheduled for December 2nd for rescheduling to Schedule 3. I think the big thing here is the U.S. has just used this, using the stick approach, right? Just kind of obviously being very much about prohibition. And it's led the way with a lot of other countries doing that. As we start to ease off, other countries are, to Chris's point, bypassing us. They're moving much faster. Their research is going faster. Their industries are getting set up. We really need to make more of a concerted effort in this country to not just with rescheduling push for that, but of course continue to push for descheduling. So I just want to use that as a moment to really stump for that because we need to make sure that our country doesn't completely fall behind when it comes to cannabis. We could be absolutely a global leader in so many ways in this industry, but as long as our federal government is just lagging on things, it's going to be very, very challenging. And it's going to lead to a lot of potential business collapse at the end of the day in this country. So yeah, I just want to throw that out there. I think that for our perspective as an organization, we've been looking to now build coalition with associations and organizations in other countries and other parts of the world, and I think that's one of the ways that we're looking to keep that dialogue moving forward and figuring out how to collaborate more.
Yeah, that's great. And watching just the federal government and the state by state approach sort of get in its own way has been a long-term frustrating aspect of all this. Aaron, you know that well.
Can I jump in on that? Just for Mike, I really appreciate what you said, and I know we've had some great conversations around that. There's a couple things. One, let's look internationally. Chris, you mentioned Europe, and they're also trying to struggling to address the intoxicating cannabinoid, synthetic, et cetera, marketplace. I like to remind folks we live in a global marketplace, and what happens when even add all the tariffs that you want onto it, that you can import Colombian weed for 10 cents on the dollar. And it's GMP certified, it's controlled, it's got, full chain of custody and shows that it's clean and safe and meets global minimum standards. You can't compete with that, let alone on, on price, let alone on you're not meeting those minimum standards. And that's the way the world works. So we really need to look at from that lens. It's really important. The second part, if I didn't lose my train of thought there, was recognizing that, we're small as an industry. We're a pretty large size, but we're still small in comparison to a lot of other, global CPG marketplaces. And so we really need to work together to create those standards. And where I was going to go with that is thinking about the federal landscape. And do we want the FDA to just tell us what to do? We've gotten here as an industry despite any support, right? So why would we be any different? Why now start saying, hey, regulator, do this? Hey, name your agency, do this. You really, really want that? Take ownership. We have an opportunity to actually create that framework. And let's not lose out on that opportunity, because that's a window and an opportunity that very few industries or individuals even get that opportunity to do. And we'd be foolish not to seize it and capitalize while we, try to figure out what that federal and international framework exists, looks like.
Absolutely. Good point. Aaron, did you want to add anything on the regulatory landscape and international regulations?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. I don't have a whole lot to add. I mean, I think that, that as public support has waned for prohibition, one of the bigger, most effective kind of talking points we've heard has been, well, we've got the single convention and treaty obligations here at home that we have no choice. Our hands are tied. And to Mike's point, as we're not the leader on this anymore, and other countries have gone ahead. It has really, I think, is going to be interesting in this hearing how that argument's laid out. And we've laid out an argument that the state regulators have an ability to uphold treaty regulations or the treaty obligations, through without going without prohibition, and allowing for rescheduling and even descheduling after that. But it's definitely going to be interesting to see how that plays out at the end of the year.
Yeah, absolutely. And our final question has to do with, predictions for the future and preparing for changes. And I think we're all anticipating the December 3rd hearing on rescheduling. So I'd like to hear any predictions for the future of cannabis regulations and standards at both federal and international levels, and anything your organization is doing to prepare for these potential changes. Mike, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think that the most important thing from our perspective is that we really need to be working, collaborating with the state regulatory agencies and legislators on how to stand up a successful state industry and make sure that there's support, proper support. Like Colorado, for example, I was speaking with their CBO recently, the Cannabis Business Office, and they have a great structure for how to provide mentorship and support, but they don't have the funding, right? So I think that's the next thing that we need to really be pushing for is how to make sure that these state programs have the way to properly support a healthy ecosystem of businesses, not just simply getting it off the ground and getting licenses issued, right? So I think, it's maybe not answering the correct question directly, but I think in a holistic perspective, that's how we can go ahead and prepare better for the next things that come down the pipeline, federally speaking.
Yeah, thanks for that. All right, Aaron, how's NCIA prepping for all this change?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm pretty optimistic around rescheduling still. I think that that's still something that is possible to get done before swearing in day in January. Well, it does make me a bit nervous, but I think that that's likely to happen, which fixes the 280E problem. That's $2 billion a year. I think we saw from Bo Whitney's report back into the industry. Beyond that, at the federal level, I think that we're probably going to continue to see a lot's going to hinge on the election, right? I think most likely we'll see a divided government. I'm hopeful that we'll have a Harris-Walz administration, which would be much more favorable to cannabis, I think, than the alternative. I'm hopeful that we'll have a Democratic House. Senate's not looking like it would probably go that way. So, it's hard to say, but we're going to have a very tightly divided government. I don't think we're going to have federal regulations on cannabis, or certainly not marijuana, in the near future. And I think all of the action is going to continue to be at the states. And I think hemp is going to continue to be legal, and it's going to be up to the states. And hopefully in partnership with the federal government in creating standards and regulations around those products. But most of the action, I think, is going to continue to be at the states in the next few years anyway.
Mm-hmm. Chris, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Congress is definitely going to want to end any gray area questions around synthetic THC, whether that's in the Farm Bill this year, the Farm Bill next year, or some other vehicle. I think Congress is really there. And I also think that it's probably not going to change a whole lot in the sense that it's always been about what states are going to do. So that's where the heavy lift is going to be when it comes to these kinds of products. I also think, and this is not going out on a limb, but if we end up with a Harris administration, we're going to have a blizzard of legalization proposals. You can bet. Everybody's going to suddenly rush to the keyboard and come up with their wish list version. I would like to think that we'll see some pragmatic proposals. And the reason for that is we're going to still have Republicans in the legislature, and we have to have them sign on or we don't get legalization. And so we need to decide how we can get these two parties talking about this issue to get something through. So that's my pitch.
Great. Thank you all for that. While we take a quick look at the pre-reg and live Q&A questions, I just want to let our audience know that we will have this recording available, and in a few days, I believe David mentioned at the beginning, any questions that came in, we will take a couple days to come up with some responses and then publish a follow-up blog with those responses. So thank you for your patience while we take a look. Curious if there's any questions in pre-reg or live Q&A that came up that any of our panelists want to respond to. And of course, I ask our audience to head to YouTube and subscribe to the GMP Collective while we wait for the episode to get ready for upload. Yeah, so David or any of our panelists in our last 120 seconds here, if you want to add any additional remarks.
Rapid fire. I'll jump in and take up some of that 120 seconds. I think back to that even question, what do we look for in the future? I think regardless of whether you identify with the color blue or red, with the political will and the popularity around legalization, right, and ending prohibition, as soon as we get a new administration, or I think we're really close to a tipping point where things are going to fall really fast. And with that, idea of just like a flurry of bills being proposed. And I want to remind folks back to that standards, kind of play here in conversation. Congress already created that framework and pathway for us to adopt voluntary consensus standards. Congress actually requires that of executive agencies through a act passed in the 90s, 1995, that folks can look up and I've referenced before. So the framework's already there. And so if you think about being on a Republican limited government standpoint, the idea of self-regulation is written right there, that opportunity for us to do that. And if you're more aligned with a less self-regulation and top-down oversight, there's still that framework and that opportunity to catalyze and leverage that type of a self-regulatory framework and voluntary consensus standards to ensure that we have a federal framework that operates for all of us and can allow us to operate on the international scale as well, because we can't forget about the international landscape and how that's inevitable. So I guess I'll just say, I really appreciate all three of you. I've worked with the three of you for years now. I think I first became an NCIA member in 2018 when I met Bethany. Chris, I've known you since pre-ATACH days, and I've known ATACH since the first ASTM meeting that I attended, which was the first ASTM meeting in June of 2017, where you guys were founding members, and that's huge. And I think, Mike, to just thank you again for recognizing the DEI committee. That was something that I and several others really worked to support to get the standard terminology, right? That lexicon, words really matter, so that we can actually have a common shared set of rules and common language to move this industry forward. And your work has just been like tireless and nonstop. And it's always a pleasure to get to run into, whether it's in California, Minnesota, or anywhere in between. So just awesome team here. And I hope this is inspiration for everybody to recognize that we can work together. These are common conversations we need to work through, including collaborating with regulators, because we all have a vested interest in a successful marketplace. How'd I do? 120 seconds done?
100%, David. All right, I just want to thank everybody again, including our audience and all the thoughtful questions. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers. Thanks, guys.